So thank you, Jason. That sounded like a little preparatorily defensive, right? Like, so thanks for the cover. I feel like I'm going to very much end the day on like an easy note and a high note, lightweight note. And yeah, the basic idea is this is a story, right? It's not technical. It's kind of about, and I'm going to show in the next slide kind of who I am, so you're going to know my bias coming into this, but my kind of 3-month time trying to kind of join a community and what that was like. And I took the time to kind of document and write down everything that I did from like my initial clone. I happened to be on an airplane, right? So at 30,000 feet, and how long did that take, and how long did it take to grab through the source, and how long did it take me to do everything. And you'll see some of those numbers there, but really about that experience, because you only get to join once, right? So it's a one-time thing. So it should be really, really easy way to end the day. So because it's a personal journey, I think that my background and my bias are a big deal in terms of framing how my journey should be received by you guys. So this is a little bit about me. So really, you can think of it as kind of like 20 years, largely in the security industry and in particular in the endpoint industry. So the idea of an agent, right, running on an endpoint makes a lot of sense. So I come with a preconceived set of notions there and a lot of experience. And I think that second point, or the second to last point rather, the longer bullet there, about the fact that in my experience, I've been able to see 8 projects like on the order of magnitude in terms of size and complexity as Osquery, and see them over time, in particular through the lens of people coming and going on the projects, and what that does, right, as certain people come and go, and how that morphs and changes how the project survives or thrives or suffers, right? And so that's kind of my bias coming in. So this is the title of the slide, the presentation rather. So where did I come from in terms of Osquery? For a couple years, I've heard of it. I've known a number of people. I have a lot of respect for the people that have been involved. So I come in kind of thinking, hey, this is a cool thing. Never downloaded the code, never even ran OSQuery. I had read the schema on osquery.io, so I have kind of a sense of how it might be architected. Totally love the fact that it's SQL-based. I think that's really beautiful and a little burst of inspiration. And I didn't know where that came from. Right? I didn't understand, the origin story. So the goal here, I gave it some thought, like how do I choose to join the community in kind of a representative way? And so my hypothesis was, well, most people who want to, in my case as a developer, right, I joined the community as a contributor, right, of source. And so I made the assumption, right or wrong, that the number one way that people would want to do that would be to say, hey, I've got the best ever table idea, right? There's some piece of telemetry that is the most important thing ever. I'd love to have that, and I want to add a virtual table to OSQuery core. And I want to make that happen right now because, I want to do that. So that was my assumption. And so I came up with one. I'll talk about that just in a couple slides. Out of that, I used the good, bad, and ugly as the kind of like the 3 categories of feedback that I have out of that experience. But again, Jason, thank you for the cover, but overall, it's a positive thing. Lastly, right before I get started, I was highly biased coming in to be excited about OSQuery, right? So it wasn't just, hey, I know a couple people that were using it and I respect them. It was actually like a deep sense of, this is a really good idea. It really resonates with me kind of very naturally. And so I had every, positive bias coming in. But, and I'm gonna get back to this towards the end in terms of like kind of a surprising place that this journey took me, was that, and I'm still not sure about this, right? I'm actually not sure what the answer is, but I'm not sure if I was kind of in love with OSQuery as it is, or OSQuery as I imagined it to be, right? Like as it was in my own mind, as if I had created it, which I clearly didn't. And I think you're gonna see kind of threaded through this presentation some discussion about, it's not entirely clear to me, again, as an outsider, right, 3 months in, so forgive me, but it's not entirely clear to me exactly what the guiding principles behind OSQuery are. I have my opinion, right? And I've heard a lot of great stuff today and over the last few days about that, but it's not entirely clear to me, and so I want to be upfront about that too. Sorry, one more extra background slide. From all those years of endpoint, right, I think endpoint's really hard. I think that I happen to be a pessimist, right, or an entropy guy on software projects and endpoint software projects in particular, so my perspective is without like constant attention and diligence and care and work, right, that software like this decays in the sense that it kind of gets worse. It degrades in its purity and its cleanliness and its value. It strays from its original purpose, and it's really hard to get that back. And because, coming in, I said, hey, I like this thing, I really want to see this go, I really would love to not have that happen. And we can't expect, right, as Nick hit this morning, right, we can't expect that 3 or 4 or 5 people are going to be able to carry the flag forever. They're not. And so the question is, how do we kind of institutionalize the right values to make sure the project outlives, whenever some core people decide to move on and do something else. So to be representative of, like, I've got the cool table and I really want to do it and I want to do it right now, I just went through the list of table requests in GitHub. I found one that I happen to have some familiarity with, which is the request was for mutexes in particular on a Windows system. I spent a lot of time with Windows, so that's pretty easy for me. Not only that, but in the ticket there was a link, might have even been from Teddy, from Pastebin about an example implementation of how to use the Windows native API in user modes, it's user mode only, to enumerate the Windows object namespace. This is WinObj from sysinternals, which is one way to do that, obviously not programmatically. So with the combination of the example code from Pastebin, a couple other places, and reversing WinObj, it was pretty easy to put together an example of how to do that. And that request was 2754. So in about 454 lines total diff, right? Not too long at all. It took about 4 hours end to end, right? Went from kind of nothing to, there's an example demonstration of being able to enumerate all Windows object types, of which mutexes, or mutant as the Windows kernel calls them, in a table. And the first column is the session ID, so it turns out that Windows objects are object namespace with names, and so of course they're segregated by what we call terminal services sessions. And so you got the terminal services session, the name itself, and then the type. In this case, because the query clause limits it to mutants, it's just mutant. So does that make sense so far? Like that was, the implementation is not the point of the talk, it was just a means to an end. So now, like, what are the takeaways? So first, that first one, obviously the mean time to Slack. Like, I actually, not kidding, I tried to make this bad. I tried to make this a bad number. So I woke up intentionally, I'm in the Eastern time zone in the US, but I woke up intentionally in the middle of the night, early in the morning. I couldn't make it bad. The worst case scenario was 3 hours of response time. Usually it was measured in a minute or two or less. So like just off the charts, like really great job. I spent most of my time in the Windows channel, but it was consistent across the channels. The intent, the positive intent around like how can we help, like again, off the charts. I mean, I'm coming in as an outsider, I'm a little bit wary, right? Am I doing this the right way? I felt really comfortable. Adding the table documentation on Read the Docs, super easy, took 5 minutes, got it, no problem. So it was clean and it was accurate. That was great. You'll see in the bad, there's obviously some places where maybe the documentation could use a little more love, but adding the table, we got that. And the code base itself, right, really makes a lot of sense in terms of structurally. It was very easy to kind of read and get my head around it and say, okay, I think I get it. So that was great. Because I came from Windows, right, and I think I hear a little bit more history about how Windows came to be from Lauren and from Nick and from some others, but I think I learned a little bit about, actually the longest thing it took me to do from the time I cloned the code to the time that I, finished those 454 lines was figuring out how to build, because I couldn't find the documentation on Read the Docs. There was a building.md, and there wasn't any mention of Windows, and so it took me a while to figure that out. Got it, took like 45 minutes, got it, no problem. Once I found the docs, it was easy. Got my first pull request in just to add a little link to the Windows docs from the building docs, so that was great, no problem. Got a lot of support in that as well. A couple other things just on kind of, and it seems from casual conversations that this is kind of a common experience, but it's not always consistent in terms of the latency or the consistency of the build jobs. I didn't dive into it, but I would expect maybe that would fit under a bucket of what Lauren would call technical debt, of just things we could do to make it better for all of us. And then ugly, and it's actually not that ugly, right? So I needed a third word. So when I wrote the implementation, as a stress test, like as an example test, just to see what would happen, I deduced, right, not from the documentation, but from reading back, back to Slack channels and from looking at the code that was more recently committed, and particularly in the virtual table implementations, that something using RAI would be great. That would be more of the preferred approach. I can't find, up to this point, kind of a document that says, hey, that's the statement, that's what we'd like to do. Maybe it exists, but I can't find it, which itself would be a little bit of a problem. I intentionally chose to do the opposite. just to see what would happen. I wanted to see whether, that would just fly right through code review, or whether that'd get somebody saying that I'm an idiot because I'm doing it a different way. And so not only did I not use that, I even put go-tos in the code. And I immediately got pushback when I, looked for a code review on the style. And that was great. Maybe we could, probably as a group, me included, try to get the documentation up to make it a little bit more accessible for someone trying to contribute for the first time. I think the bigger question for me on that, though, is that, most of the discussions I had with about 5 different people in total were around the coding style itself, which clearly is important. But in my view, and this is just my view, the code itself, the implementation, can be changed whenever, right? That's relatively simple. But the schema and how the data is chosen to be represented is, again, in my view, more difficult to change, because once that table becomes published, people rely on it and there's more resistance to change. And so from my perspective, and I'll cover this in a later slide, but I feel like there's definitely maybe a discussion point around how to have kind of more discussion around, hey, do we have the schema the way we want it? Is it consistent across all the 208, I think I heard a couple hours ago, tables that we have right now? And is it, the right join keys in the right place to kind of, really have an additive effect across all the tables and as we add more? Last one there, the high degree of enthusiasm. I got a lot of support, which made me feel really welcome. But it was almost, I said, like, the only person who kind of was resistant to jamming it in and making it happen was actually me, because I was afraid that I hadn't thought through enough yet the point I just made around, like, am I presenting this data the right way? So in this example, the hierarchical object namespace in Windows is just that. It's like a file system. It's arbitrarily deep, recursive structure. And what I chose to do was kind of put a flat view on that, which makes it simple to query and simple to understand, but also less flexible, less powerful, and less arbitrary. So in order to enumerate the entire namespace, you would actually need yet another table, right? So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know, because I don't know what the kind of like where we want to take it as a group or what our guidelines are. So now I'm going to switch gears. I got 5 more slides, and then either we can get up here early or we can chat or whatever. One of the things I struggled with was not being able to find in writing kind of a clear statement of what the guiding principles around Osquery are. Like, what is Osquery? That was what I, hit earlier. Like, I had an idea of what I thought it was, and I've written them down here. This is kind of like what I wanted it to be, but it's, it's not about me, clearly, right? Either in the past tense or the future, right? So what is that supposed to look like? And this is actually really interesting because, in my view, right, if there's a central place where we can say, hey, this is what Osquery is and what it isn't, and make that explicit, it makes it a lot easier to have discussions about what should or shouldn't be included, or how that would look, or how it would get put together. And making that really easy and front and center for somebody new to just absorb and say, okay, I get it, I see where this came from, right? And I heard some really good stuff today, during the talks, to say, hey, now I kind of understand how this came to be, or what was the set of problems that resulted in the generation of the whole project or different parts of it. I think that'd be really useful to kind of frame everyone's thinking, right, going forward, and have a common set of understanding about what Osquery is or isn't. Now this is fun right here, this next slide. So I had to just put this slide in while I was sitting in the back. So my previous slide was, hey, I couldn't find any guiding principles. Then I found out, right, and so Mike, I don't know where Mike is, but there's Mike in the back, I guess, from Trail of Bits. I guess you're speaking tomorrow, right? And so I happened to be scrolling through on my phone, and I said, look at this, started with guiding principles. I'm like, that's fantastic, but it's in this, the summary of a talk that you may be doing tomorrow, right, on the QueryCon page, right, as compared to, like, Osquery itself. And
that's how you become a thought leader.
Yeah, there we go. So we got a thought leader back there. So I don't even, maybe you made him up, right? Like, I don't even know, right? So so that's pretty cool, but I think, like, this sounds good to me, but I think that would be a core community thing to, like, articulate and understand and come to some degree of consensus on. So as an example, Lauren, when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking a lot about, you presented a set of ways, right, the project could evolve. Those all sound cool, but they have their pros and cons, right? But what do we measure them against, right? What's the North Star, the guiding principles that we can say, hey, this makes sense or it doesn't? So this is, one level down, a little bit more technical. I hit on this already in terms of the overall schema. So 208 tables, like, my view on, like, looking at the combination of the schema as it is and the commits. So I actually took some time and went through a lot of the, the commit messages over time. And it looks, I think, and I don't think I'm going to get any objection from this, but it looks like, hey, a lot of people over a number of years have put tables in to kind of solve a problem. And there's been a light degree of coordination, right, across all of those. And so sometimes it makes a lot of sense, sometimes it doesn't. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? I don't know, right, because I don't really understand, what we're trying to achieve and whether it's worth trying to like centralize that with all the negatives that come along that, but there's also some positives or vice versa. The second point is just like, it's a little bit more technical, but it's there just to kind of like provoke a question. So, obviously, normally if I'm querying a SQL database and I'm joining across multiple tables, the database engine will enforce all the locking to ensure that the data is not changing out from under me during the join. And so I get a level of consistency out of that. Fundamentally with what we're doing, right, so if you query, say, the process list, and then you query the sockets list, and you have the PID to tie the two together, they're two separate queries to the operating system made some amount of time apart. And so therefore, there's a race there where you could end up with something missing, or worse, in particular on Windows, PIDs are reused in a non-linear order, right? So you potentially have a case where you end up with data that's mismatched. Is that bad, right? Clearly it's bad conceptually, right? But is it bad enough that we're concerned about it? It's back to, I don't know again either, but is this something that's going to be a foundation of telemetry you want to have with really high reliability? Maybe want to go back and think about that, right? I don't know, but it's a point. Mind if I get some water? This is too much for me. Got it. Okay, so this second to last one here, I think it goes to Lauren's point. Sorry, excuse me. Read it. So it's really a variation of the first point around the guiding principles. What is a strategic goal? Thank you. Triple soothing action. I love it. So, appreciate it. For example, would a goal to be, hey, we'd love to have, I'm going to make a number up, right? 1 billion endpoints in the world running Osquery. Is that a good thing, right? Or is that a bad thing? I don't know that either. And I think that kind of went to my question around, what's the target audience and how do we segment the audience? And if the goal is breadth, right, there has to be some sacrifice of the purity of it. And maybe that's a good thing or maybe that's a bad thing. Last one, and so this one is a little bit more prescriptive in terms of my perspective. It's just my perspective from a guy who just started 3 months ago and hasn't even committed his actual, or pushed his actual table. Maybe it won't be. But because of kind of how easily I found it to be able to kind of get support and energy around adding a new table to core, I really love the extension model. I think that's really powerful, and all you guys who were part of that, that's awesome. I think, there's an argument to be made around kind of like some sort of promotion model, like to include new tables in some sort of model where it goes in and some amount of time it happens, review and feedback, right? And my perspective out of that is really formed by what I would consider to be a lot of negative inertia around being able to change tables, right? Because that's kind of the contract with the outside world after they're already out, and especially if they've been out for a year or more, right? And so I'm making this up. I haven't seen any discussion that says that that's true, but I'm assuming that that's going to be difficult. If we had 500 tables and more, I could see the project kind of getting bogged down a little bit by its own weight. And so the question would, how do you kind of slow it down in order to ultimately get a kind of more streamlined view that we're more happy with over the long haul? And now I'm going to say something a little more dramatic because I'm speaking entirely here as an individual, but I do have an employer, right? And there are a number of commercial entities, right, including for-profit entities that are using Osquery to kind of materially enhance the value that they're providing their customers. And Nick hit it reasonably hard this morning, the idea around hey, we're going to need some additional support from the community, particularly around the core. This is hard work. Endpoint is hard, software engineering is hard, maintaining things in the support of high volumes of usage is hard. It doesn't come for free, and some of the work is not glamorous, and we need to kind of figure out the best way to get that work done. I don't know what the right answer is, right? But I think it's fair, in my opinion, for the community to like say, hey, you know, we have certain, you know, non-contractual, right, but certain reasonable expectations of vendors, including my own employer, right, in terms of what kind of minimum level kind of return of energy, of dollars, of resources, of something to the community. And in my opinion, the longer kind of we go without that set of norms, the harder it will be to introduce them, right? And so I think, you know, this is a everyone benefits from kind of situation. Facebook's very generous to kind of open source this in the first place, but we can't expect Facebook to shoulder the burden forever. And so, you know, I think we need to at least start the discussion around how that can happen. All right, so last slide. I left where I started. It's a fantastic project. I appreciate, for those of you that have interacted with either on Slack over the last number of months or in person, I appreciate everything. It's been almost, you know, really almost universal, really great reception. And, you know, honestly, it just makes me feel like it's a place I want to return to. You know, it's comforting, it's welcoming. I'm still really excited about the project. After today, I have to say that my excitement level is even higher. There's been some really great stuff, and I've learned a lot just in the last few hours. You know, the last slide, or sorry, the last point there is, again, as an outsider, as someone very new, you know, to the whole, maybe the feeling is that in order to make Osquery the best it can be, that maybe we need a little tough love up front now to kind of see a benefit over a number of years, and that, you know, maybe it's the right time to start having those kind of conversations. I feel like a number of those points have been woven into some of the presentations already, which to me indicates a kind of a general interest in and willingness to have those conversations. But, you know, somehow, if that's concrete's gonna happen out of that, we're gonna have to kind of force that in some way. So I don't know how to do that myself. Clearly, that's not, you know, my direct role. I'm just here to kind of offer my journey and my perspective from the outside, and there you have it. So that's all I've got.